we are getting into that procurement area. So what is procurement? Essentially, procurement is like that end of the shopping piece. And it's the act of officially acquiring something, in this case, a software product, where an aggregate of steps is taken to inform the search and selection process. So whether or not a purchase is being made, the procurement process is one that museum staff, archive staff, whichever sort of institution you're in, is something to be engaged in thoughtfully. It's not a quick process, it tends to be a longer process. Now, procurement will depend on what your organization looks like. For example, if you are a city, state, or federal organization, the procurement process is going to be pretty heavily dictated. In which case, great, you can ask for what that looks like and how to get started. There's usually a procurement person or department that you will then work with to establish the specifications. The vendors you've reached out to that meet your criteria, you'll invite them to submit a bid. And it's at that point an official procurement process to go through in order to help meet whatever sort of tick boxes you need to for compliance. If you are not a municipally funded organization, you're more on the nonprofit side or private side, there may not necessarily be a procurement process, or there may be one if your institution's large enough, but it won't be perhaps nearly as stringent as if you were city, state, or federal. So just ask the question if you're not sure in terms of who's in charge of helping to vet and do selection of software, and who needs to be involved. Because sometimes, depending on your institution, you'll need some sort of like IT person, for example, who will need to be involved in those conversations and selection process. Regardless of official procurement process or not, there will be some sort of contract negotiation and signing. I do want to highlight that while the vendor, if it's proprietary, while the vendor will provide you a contract, contracts are usually always up for negotiation, at least that scope of work part. And when you're thinking and entering into a collections management system contract, it is pretty typical to have some conversation in terms of this is our budget, this is like how many licenses we're looking for. And one area I see that helps with negotiations is if you know you're going to be with the product for at least 5 years, which like nobody wants to switch systems more than every 5 years, trust me. The longer you commit to that product, sometimes the cheaper that annual rate can get. So, for example, if you were working with a product and the contract negotiation was just 12 months, it will probably be very expensive for that 12 months. But if you offer to sign it for 3, 5, 10 years, that annual cost over time can be greatly reduced. So asking those types of questions, especially if you know you're not going to be hopping products for at least a certain amount of years, can be a great sort of lever to pull if you're looking at a pretty big price tag, but still have like major budget constrictions. Another thing, be aware of all costs. So again, when thinking back to when we started, costs that were one-time costs, costs that are annual costs, keep in mind that if you're doing an annual contract, there's likely going to be an annual increase. Look for that in the contract and make sure that you understand that. And also maybe do some math on whether or not that increase in percentage is in line with average of inflation year over year. If it is more than the average of inflation, I recommend negotiating it down. Otherwise, if it's in the rate of inflation, then that's the cost of doing business. So I wouldn't recommend trying to negotiate that point. I recommend establishing a timeline, especially when you're in the contract process, because you're not just working with your own organization's timeline and restrictions, you are now going to be working with another company's timeline and restrictions. So if you are on a timeline crunch, and that's not necessarily understood by the vendor, and they've not disclosed what sort of timeline they're on for your implementation, then there can be a pretty severe mismatch. This was exacerbated during COVID when almost everybody who wasn't already using a collections management system online was like desperately and quickly trying to switch to one. So, understandably, collections management system companies were like really hit hard in terms of timeline. That has gotten much better, especially now that we're almost in 2025. But still, be aware of timelines and where you are within that timeline, because it's not just yours to be aware of. And then assigning that responsibilities piece, especially if you are doing any sort of data migration, having an excellent understanding of what it is the vendor is going to do for you versus what they expect you to do. There can be a mismatch there. And if you've not already accounted for staff time, or let alone knowledge of data cleanup, then you will want the vendor to do the heavy lifting on that part. Or if you do have that stock capacity, great. Negotiate with the vendor because they won't need to do it necessarily. So some balance of costs there.